Diolch yn fawr, Elin. I will be reading from a different screen, so I apologize for that. Noswaith da, felly, before I start, I would like to thank the Centre and its director, Professor Elin Haf-Griffith-Jones, for the invitation to give a talk this evening. It's an honor and a privilege to be here with you, and so diolch o galon. I would like to start properly then with the following quotation. Let's see. Yes, from Bruce Chatwin's In Patagonia, published in 1977, which I reread recently when selecting materials for a new lecture. As he arrives in Port Madryn, Chatwin observes the following. I walked along the esplanade and looked out at the even line of cliffs spreading round the bay. The cliffs were a lighter grey than the grey of the sea and sky. The beach was grey and littered with dead penguins. Halfway along was a concrete monument in memory of the Welsh. It looked like the entrance to a bunker. Let into its slides were bronze reliefs representing barbarism and civilization. Barbarism showed a group of the Welsh Indians, naked, with slabby back muscles in the Soviet style. The Welsh were on the side of civilization. Greybeards, young men with sides, big-breasted girls with babies. So some of the audience here today may be familiar with the monument that Chatwin describes, which dominates the Puerto Madryn seafront. Although Chatwin's interpretation is not evident from the reliefs themselves, we may understand his reference to the civilization versus barbarism dichotomy better if we consider its context. Chatwin traveled around Patagonia in 1974, 5 years before the state would celebrate with great fanfare the centenary of the so-called conquest of the desert. These military campaigns, led by General Roca between 1879 and 1884, were meant to have finally claimed Patagonia for the Argentine state, putting an end to what statesmen called at the time the problem of the Indian. Despite agreeing to establish a settlement on behalf of a state whose national consolidation was based precisely on that civilization versus barbarism dichotomy, the leaders of the Welsh migration to Patagonia had expressed their mistrust of that trope as early as 1862. Hugh Cadvan Hughes had issued the following warning in his Handbook of the Welsh Colony, published in 1862. We are aware that the general idea about Patagonia was that it is an empty, hideous desert with swarms of half-monsters roaming around it to kill and destroy everything. That was the idea passed on to us at school about that white spot at the bottom of the South American map. But by the time we reach the age of discernment and questioning, we realized that not everything we were taught at school was correct. Let the reader remember the strange ideas lectured to him about the history of the Welsh in his English history lessons, how they were portrayed as cruel, naked savages before the ubiquitous English came to hammer civilization, quote unquote, into them, by means of the, quote unquote, long knives. And again, in the Middle Ages, that they were a swarm of barbarians pushed to the mountains of Wales so that they would not hinder civilization, quote unquote, as wild monsters chased into the woods. The analogy drawn between the presumed barbarity of Patagonia's indigenous peoples and the Welsh suggests a feeling of empathy grounded on the subaltern status of both groups. We may presume that this perception of co-subalternity would be crucial in the strategy adopted by the Welsh pioneers towards Patagonia's indigenous peoples, namely, and I quote, to defeat the Indian through kindness. In case that didn't work and things got difficult, however, they did have a small defensive army to which they could resort. Nevertheless, there were relatively few instances of conflict in the first decade and a half, and the link proved quite fruitful for both groups. It was thanks to Patagonia's indigenous peoples, whom they would have considered, and I quote, a little more civilized than the Argentine soldiers, that the Welsh managed to survive in the rugged steppe, as they established a mutually beneficial bond of economic complementarity that saw substantial quantities of flour and wheat exchanged for ostrich feathers and hides. Rather than this being a direct result of the alleged peaceful and benevolent nature of the Tehuelche, about which Argentinian school textbooks used to comment, or perhaps a response to the devout and charitable spirit of the Welsh, we may be forgiven for thinking those amicable terms stemmed, at least in part, from the treaty originally signed by the Argentine government and the Welsh leaders, Francisco, Antonio, and Chiquichan, committing rations and livestock to be sent to their communities as compensation for the use of their territories, and as long as they supported and defended the Welsh settlement. However, circumstances changed dramatically with the advent of the conquest of the desert in 1879. I think I missed. When the Argentine state effectively occupied eastern Patagonia by dispossessing and decimating indigenous populations, destroying their livelihoods and social networks. Hailed as, and I quote, a trope and enactment of Argentina's manifest destiny, end of quote, the brutal campaigns pushed the southern frontier and opened the land for white settlement, ranching, and agricultural exploitation. I reckon now is a good time to focus on the more theoretical aspect of my presentation today. That is, this one, that is settler colonialism. Settler colonialism differs from franchise colonialism in that, whereas the latter focuses on labor exploitation and or resource extraction, settler colonialism seeks to replace the original population of the colonized territory with a new society of settlers, usually from a colonial metropole. Whilst they both rely on exogenous domination, the specific irreducible element of settler colonialism is territoriality, claims Patrick Wolfe, one of the most important theorists in the field. For a settler society to be successfully established on the expropriated land, native societies need to be dissolved, a settler colonial tendency that Wolfe terms the logic of elimination. Nevertheless, settler colonialism is inherently eliminatory but not invariably genocidal, Wolfe clarifies. Rather than being circumscribed to physical annihilation, this eliminatory logic may include a range of options such as officially encouraged miscegenation, the breaking down of native title into alienable individual freeholds, native citizenship, child abduction, religious conversion, resocialization in total institutions such as missions or boarding schools, and a whole range of cognate biocultural assimilations. Also, because settlers come to stay, and thus invasion is a structure, not an event, land occupation is not a superseded event, but rather a cornerstone of settler colonial polities. Wolfe argues, and elimination thus becomes an organizing principle of settler colonial society. The conquest of the desert is a clear illustration of elimination as an organizing principle, not only in how indigenous populations were massacred, the physical dimension of elimination, but also in how the military campaigns were presented to the general populations from their very name. The choice of the term desert to refer to the Patagonian territories was not really based on their aridity or sparse population, but rather on the persistence of indigenous autonomy in those areas outside state control. This was even clearer in the case of the subsequent occupation of the Chaco region in 1884, which was named the conquest of the Green Desert. The eliminatory logic is very clear here. By describing the military campaigns as aimed to conquer deserts, indigenous presence was negated at the very point of enunciation. Far from constituting a unique case, this symbolic elimination replicates well-trodden notions of emptiness found in other narratives of settlement. Nevertheless, in stark contrast to the way North American settler narratives attempted to obfuscate the foundational violence at the root of the settlement, the Argentine nation proudly proclaimed itself as forged through its assault on the desert and the proclaimed extermination of indigenous populations. As Gastón Gordillo and Silvia Hirsch put it, the notion that the indigenous past had been wiped out confirmed that Argentina had finally become a European nation, emerging like the phoenix from the purifying violence of the state. Although what we now call Argentina covers much more than the Patagonia region, the conquest of the desert became central to the self-representation of Argentina as white in race and European in culture, as it consolidated, and I quote, a national image based upon the negation of any indigenous contribution to the configuration of Argentineness and Argentina itself, end of quote. It is precisely this eliminatory narrative that renders a settler colonial analysis particularly productive. But how would this apply to Welsh Patagonia, you may be wondering? Surely the fact that Oladva, as a settlement is known in the Welsh language, was establishing on behalf of the Argentine government spares the pioneers from being tarred with the same brush as, say, the British in Australia. And the fact that they were escaping from what they described as colonial oppression in their native Wales surely means that they cannot be accused of colonialism themselves, right? Well, I'm afraid it's not as simple as that. Let's look at the facts. Firstly, although they were negotiating the settlement with the Argentine government in Buenos Aires, the leaders of the Welsh migration were aware of the rights of indigenous Patagonians to those lands. It was precisely because of this that they supported the Tehuelche in their claims when government rations from Buenos Aires were withheld in breach of the above-mentioned Tratado Tehuelcho, a stance which, according to Glyn Williams, would have, and I quote, aroused the suspicion of the Argentine authorities, end of quote. Lewis Jones himself escorted a group of indigenous leaders when they traveled all the way to Buenos Aires in 1867 to protest about that, a moment which was immortalized in this striking photograph. Secondly, though it never reached its intended recipient, a letter originally addressed to Lewis Jones as superintendent of the Chupat colony contains precious little evidence of what things may have looked like from the perspective of indigenous populations. The letter was dictated in December 1865 by Chieftain Antonio, who assumed ownership of the plains of Chupat, which were the territories the Welsh occupied. And he claimed the following: "Be not afraid of us, my friend. I and my people are contented to see you colonize on the Chupat, for we shall have a nearer place to go in order to trade, without the necessity of going the additional 300 miles to Patagones, where they steal our horses and where pulperos rob and cheat us. If you treat us well, as the vessels on the coast treat the Tehuelches, and if your traders do not cheat us, we shall always negotiate with you. Antonio seemed to refer to the Tehuelcho Treaty in his mention that Mr. Aguirre has read a letter of the governor to me, in which I am told to leave you to increase in numbers and not to do anything to you, and also to speak to the other caciques that they should not molest you. I promise to do all in my power for you. End of quote. However, the letter went on to state, in no uncertain terms, his claims to those territories. He says, now I say that the plains between the Chupat and the Rio Negro are ours, and that we never sold them. Our fathers sold the plains of Bahía Blanca and Patagones, but nothing more. I have a treaty of peace with Patagones, but that doesn't touch on selling lands. I know very well that you have negotiated with the government to colonize Chupat, but you ought also to negotiate with us, who are the owners of the lands. It is worth noting, yeah, that's the one at the bottom. It is worth noting the slight contradiction found in a subsequent paragraph in this regard. Antonio says, now I say that if we had not been contented to trade with good people like you, we should not have sold the land. You ought, for my portion of the land, to negotiate with the government. See what they can pay me for it. Everywhere they sell and buy, but they do not colonize without buying. End of quote. So is Antonio suggesting now he did sell the land after all? This would surely contradict what he had stated categorically earlier in the letter. Could this be a misunderstanding or a mistranslation, perhaps? We shall never know. Nevertheless, the contents of the rest of the paragraph and its placement towards the end of the letter, and just after Antonio's detailed description of what they were intending to trade with the Welsh, suggests his comment may have been meant to highlight the goodwill of his people towards this new commercial partnership. Indeed, it seems Antonio was as invested as the Welsh pioneers in using kindness to win the new neighbors over. Regardless of Antonio's shrewd diplomacy skills, we also need to bear in mind the nature of the source which we are considering. It was dictated by Antonio to Swiss naturalist and explorer George Claras in a Spanish that was definitely not his first language. When preparing the ground for their eventual fruitful commercial relations, Antonio clarifies that he spoke a little Spanish, but didn't understand English. Sabemos un poco de castellano, pero no entendemos inglés, he says. And his words were then translated into English by a Swiss. In addition, no original copy of the letter has been found, and we only know about it thanks to its inclusion in an English language report presented to both Houses of Parliament in 1867, which entails a further layer of potential linguistic meddling. Ultimately, the problem lies in the asymmetries particular to the context. As Lorenzo Veracini, a prominent theorist of settler colonialism, has observed, the specific, and I quote, the specific circumstances of the settler colonial situation contribute to making mutually constructed meaning problematic. It is worth asking at this point, why is it that we have access to dozens of chronicles, diaries, and letters written by emigrants from Wales and other European countries, as well as by Argentine officials, but such few sources representing the perspective of indigenous populations? And this is not, I hasten to clarify, just the result of indigenous peoples favoring oral tradition. So On the one hand, there's evidence that a peaceful coexistence was established between both groups on the basis of their economic complementarity. That in turn has been seen as a suggestion that things may have turned out to be different had the Welsh settlers been allowed to continue to conduct affairs in their own way. On the other hand, it is difficult to disagree with Glyn Williams's view that, and I quote, by leaving it to the Argentine authorities to negotiate the terms of settlement with the native leaders, Lewis Jones recognized Argentine rather than native claims to the area. End of quote. This alignment with the Argentine state was unequivocal, after the above-mentioned conquest of the desert. Even though there's evidence that Welsh settlers tried to mediate with officials to spare their Tehuelche associates when Roca's military campaigns reached Chubut, and notably lamented the outcome of the raids, it was the dispossession of indigenous populations that made massive extensions of land available for white settlement. It was in the aftermath of Roca's military campaigns that those territories became available, as it were. Though the Welsh would eventually receive a relatively small portion of all the new lands occupied, their expansion towards the west was forged by means of a collaboration with the state. Headed by Colonel Luis Jorge Fontana, the well-known and much celebrated Rifleros expedition was largely composed and resourced by the Welsh settlers. And it was thanks to that recce journey that they were granted land in the areas towards the Andes, now known as Trevelin and Esquel. So even if we take into account the positive aspects of the link between the Welsh settlers and Patagonia's indigenous populations, it's hard to deny that the settlers' acceptance of those territories makes them participants, others may say complicit, in the wider process of dispossession suffered by indigenous peoples in what eventually came to be known as Argentina. And whilst that participation is, of course, not exclusive to the Welsh community, the early nature of their settlement, their de facto autonomy during the first decades, and the fact that they had such direct contact with indigenous populations give more significance to their role in this respect. The direct contact with indigenous populations emerges quite clearly in the many chronicles and various autobiographical materials published about the settlement, not only in the early times, but also later on, especially when the amity between the Welsh and the Tehuelche is discussed. In my contrapuntal reading of 4 memoirs written by Welsh descendants in Patagonia towards the end of the 20th century, I came across different expressions of what Anna Johnston and Alan Lawson have described as the ambivalent double bind to an ancestral link that on the one hand provides cultural authority, but also requires contestation in the interest of differentiation. Interestingly, this double bind also operates with regard to the indigenous inhabitants of the settled territories, who are deemed to hold the second of the 2 kinds of authority and authenticity that the settler subject longs for and avows at the same time. In a manner not unlike Frantz Fanon's racial fetishism, the settler is seen simultaneously to desire the cultural authority of the ancestral home and to reject it as a differentiation strategy, whilst at the same time desiring the authentic authority of the indigenous populations and being obliged to disavow or eliminate them in order to fend off the undermining of the permanence and legitimacy of the settler colony. A further layer is added in the case of the Welsh settlement in Patagonia, if we consider that the migration was meant to be an attempt to break away from the subordinate standing of Wales in the British context, what the promoters of the migration described as social oppression. Johnston and Lawson's view of the settler subject as both colonized and colonizing may thus be adjusted in this case into both decolonizing and colonizing. Through this theoretical lens, autobiographical materials are read as textual representations of settler colonial formations, which are thus revealed as a major site of struggle, where settler anxieties and obsessions are played out long after the event of the arrival of the settler. This perspective sheds light on the tensions inherent to the settler status of the memoirists, both as Welsh descendants and as Argentinians. We do not have time today to look in detail at the 4 memoirs considered in the volume, but I shall try to explain how they reproduced in different ways the settler colonial narrative of the Argentine state, especially with regard to indigenous populations. Although their treatment of indigenous Patagonians varies greatly, the 4 memoirs could be said to reproduce what theorists describe as the strategy of displacement-replacement, which comprises 2 steps. The first move is the disavowing of the indigenous as an attempt to counteract the anxiety experienced by the settler when confronted with indigenous cultural authenticity and authority. In the 4 memoirs I have analyzed, this disavowal is performed in 2 main ways. On the one hand, indigenous presence may be relegated to the past, in line with the well-known trope of the vanishing Indian, according to which indigenous groups were incapable of coping with progress and civilization, and settlers simply assumed the place of the disappearing indigene without the need for violence. Following this rationale, the existence of indigenous peoples in the present is denied, as so-called indigenous descendants would not be properly indigenous. Patrick Wolfe has referred to this romantic stereotyping of what indigenous people should and should not be as repressive authenticity, as a strategy of delegitimization which also results in the denial of indigenous differential rights. Other narratives, however, participate in a more sophisticated form of disavowal by reproducing what in this particular case has been termed the Araucanization argument. It's difficult to explain this in a nutshell, but I shall do my best here. The Araucanization argument proffers that the autochthonous Argentinian, quote-unquote, natives would be the indigenous Tehuelche inhabiting southern Patagonia. According to this argument, the Tehuelche would have later been beleaguered and eventually acculturated by the Mapuche, who were formerly called Araucanians, hence the term. The Mapuche would have ventured across from the Andes, and that is said to be nowadays Chile. So this argument blames the Mapuche for what it proclaims to be the extinction of the Tehuelche, but also results in a disavowal of the indigenous peoples in the present. How so, you may ask? Because those self-recognizing as Tehuelche are not accepted as authentic on the basis of their alleged degeneration as a result of miscegenation. At the same time, Mapuche communities living on Argentine soil are also deemed inauthentic, either because they would have changed so much that they cannot be considered indigenous any longer, or because they are seen as Chilean imposters. In materials about the Welsh in Patagonia, the Araucanization argument tends to surface not only in relation to the alleged friendly terms between the settlers and the Tehuelche, rather than the Mapuche, but also when the Kelkane incident is blamed on the Mapuche. So for those of you unfamiliar with this incident, in 1884, An unidentified indigenous party attacked 4 Welshmen apparently prospecting for gold in western Chubut. This episode brought John Daniel Evans and his horse Malacara to fame as the only survivors of the massacre, and gave the remote rural spot the dramatic name of Dyffryn y Merthyron, Valley of the Martyrs. It is often assumed that the Araucanization argument is a specific Patagonian development and thus particular to the region. However, similar arguments have been put forward in, for example, New Zealand and Southern Africa, where alleged historical records of pre-settlement displacements and exterminations are used in the same way to discredit the putative autochthonousness of contemporary indigenous populations, who are then accused of having dispossessed the true indigenes. This narrative that discursively displaces indigenous peoples to the exterior of the settler locale and treats them as exogenous others is indeed a feature of a catalogue compiled by the above-mentioned Veracini, where he describes a range of settler strategies deployed in order to, and I quote, manipulate the population economy by discursively or practically emptying the indigenous sector of the population system or sections of it, end of quote. Veracini characterizes this strategy as an approach whereby, and I quote again, indigenous peoples are not considered indigenous to the land and are therefore perceived as exogenous others who have entered the settler space at some point in time, and preferably after the arrival of the settler collective. So we can see how contextualizing the Araucanization narrative within settler colonial theorizations helps challenge exceptionalist accounts by exposing it as a standard argument deployed by settler states in order to disavow indigenous territorial claims. Going back to the, Going back to the strategy of displacement replacement, the second of the two steps comprises the indigenization of the settler. So if you have read any of the chronicles or indeed watched any of the many S4C documentaries broadcast along the years, you will remember the striking, colorful depictions of the poncho-wearing Welsh gauchos, riding their horses deftly across the pais and eating asado. The lens of settler colonial theory interprets these images of white settlers cultivating what are deemed to be native attributes and skills as a way to stake a claim to indigeneity. By referring to themselves and their culture as indigenous, Johnston and Lawson claim, settlers would be seeking to cement, and I quote, their legitimacy, their own increasingly secure sense of moral, spiritual, and cultural belonging in the new place, end of quote. Moreover, even though place emerges as a recurrent theme in a range of colonial literatures, its special discursive treatment in settler colonial contexts is seen as a key vehicle for indigenization. The focus on the difficulties experienced upon arrival and during periods of hardship before the eventual success of the settlement emerges as a feature of these narratives, even in cases where settlers establish residence in fertile territories, such as the north of Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, or Peru. Wherever settlers relocate, narratives of settlement tend to highlight the uninhabited and barren nature of those environments, which are then turned into thriving lands of plenty, thanks to the efforts of the settlers and their determination to implant progress and civilization. In relation to this, it's relevant to cite here what Veracini has described as, and I quote, the pervasive and ubiquitous relevance of a settler libidinal investment on the notion of virgin land, end of quote. This sense of hard-earned spiritual belonging that is crucial to the rooting of the settlers and to their self-definition is replicated in Welsh Patagonian memoirs right from Abram Matthews's canonical account. Furthermore, in the case of Welsh Patagonians, this is further strengthened by a self-identification with the scriptures that sets the Bible as a constant intertext, rendering the pioneers as already familiar with the new territories by resort to the biblical analogy while simultaneously naturalizing their presence in Patagonia. Another feature closely linked to the settler colonial displacement replacement project is, of course, Guila glenyard, the Festival of the Landing, celebrated every 28th of July to mark the arrival of the first contingent of Welsh pioneers in 1865 on the Mimosa Clipper. This Patagonian version of the North American Thanksgiving Day includes a number of features, starting with a morning prayer facilitated by the Mapuche Tehuelche Pufotum Mapu community at 7:30 a.m., which is followed by the hoisting of the Argentine, Welsh and indigenous flags. Homage is then paid to the Welsh pioneers by placing flowers at the monument described earlier by Chatwin. The centerpiece of the festivities comes at midday, with the recreation of the landing and the so-called meeting of cultures, when the newly arrived Welsh pioneers, often played by dressed-up Welsh descendants, meet up with indigenous Patagonians and exchange bread and guanaco meat, and I quote, as a symbol of the amity of yesteryear. Both groups then divide into teams and compete in the barrel race, which sees settlers versus natives competing to take a heavy barrel across the finish line. The festival would have started as an ethnic celebration as early as 1866, that is, only 1 year after the arrival of the Mimosa, and gained layers of officialdom along the decades. Chubut's passage from national territory to proper province in 1955 resulted in a significant change in this respect, as Chubut adopted the so-called Feet of the Welsh, Gesta Galesa in Spanish, as foundational narrative, and Guila glenyard became the first public holiday in the new province. The celebration of the centenary of the landing in 1965 marked a milestone in the history of the festival, and so did the 150th anniversary celebrated in 2015, when authorities and public figures from both Argentina and Wales attended the festivities. In his official speech for the occasion, the governor of Chubut sang the praises of what he described as, and I quote, one of the most wonderful processes of social integration in Argentina, a completely peaceful encounter in coexistence that may only be found in few places around the world. The position of prominence gained by the friendly link between the Welsh and the Tehuelche and its official endorsement may seem to go against the logic of elimination that Wolf described as an organizing principle of settler colonial society. Given that, as Veracini points out, the presence of indigenous peoples, and I quote, upsets the settler libidinal economy focusing on unspoiled, untouched circumstances and providential gifts by revealing the prior and meaningful relationship with the land, settler colonialism is characterized by a non-encounter, a circumstance fundamentally shaped by a recurring need to disavow the presence of indigenous others in an attempt to erase the settler beginnings of intrusion and violence. If the attempt to establish the fiction of a righteous settler polity relies on this disavowal of the presence of indigenous others, as Veracini has proposed, how should we understand this overpresence, as it were, of the indigenous others in Welsh Patagonian narratives? Well, we could say that through the much-touted friendship with the Tehuelche, the Welsh may be seen as partaking of a degree of indigeneity, which effectively enables what Johnson and Lawson described as a narrative of ethical indigenization. Whilst the amicable links between both peoples is a source of pride for the ethnic community, it is its appropriation by the province of Chubut that I find more compelling. We may agree that the loose reenactment of the landing of the first pioneers reactivates the overall framework of meaning that the mythomotor of the so-called Welsh feat holds for the ethnic community. But what does it do for the wider context? What role does it play for Argentina as a state predicated on indigenous dispossession and arguably genocide? And this is what I consider important about my presentation today. Not so much what the Welsh settlers might have done differently 150 years ago, but rather what we do about the structures of settler colonialism now, how we right our wrongs and build a better, fairer future, if at all possible. Veracini himself has recognized that telling the end of the settler colonial story is a fraught endeavor, and it is definitely too early for Argentina to successfully undertake a process of indigenous national reconciliation. An important step, however, is to challenge our settler common sense and to acknowledge what Veracini has described, and I quote, as the unreformed immanence of fundamentally unequal relations between indigenous peoples and their non-indigenous counterparts, the settlers. So in that spirit, it is important to recognize the role that the Welsh settlement played in Argentina's displacement replacement project as a sort of advance party before the effective occupation of Patagonia by the state. Though the task may be uncomfortable and even unpleasant, we should perhaps draw inspiration from the words of Hugh Carvan-Hughes in his Handbook of the Welsh Colony, and now we seem to have reached an age of discernment and questioning, realize that not everything we were taught at school was correct. Diolch yn fawr am wrando. Many thanks for listening.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, Geraldine. Papur anhygoel o ddiddorol yn fanna. Many thanks indeed. Really inspiring paper there. And I'm sure that we will have many questions or comments from around the room, and please put your hands up or agorwch eich mic as you see fit to indicate that you'd like to make a comment there. But if I may take the opportunity as chair to start the conversation perhaps, and also to ask you about perhaps some of the sort of theoretic work that you presented this evening, you know, and in particular looking at the disavowal and looking at the indigenization and so on. Is there any evidence that there is what we might, I don't know, I'm looking for terms really, but is there any evidence that theorists have been looking specifically at that relationship between, let's say, the Welsh settlers here and the Mapuche or the Tehuelche, of course, in terms of it, you know, the lesser of two evil type of approach, you know, that sliding scale of it could have been even worse, or, you know, that kind of, those kinds of narratives are perhaps used in order to sweeten that bitter pill, perhaps, of that relationship between being a real settler. I know that you referred to sort of settler colonialism right at the beginning, but is that kind of trope used? Is that kind of narrative used in the way that people conceptualize that process?
Yes, definitely. I think that's the traditional approach. And there's some truth in that. So obviously, if we compare what the Welsh settlers were able to establish with the Tehuelche in the first few decades of the settlement, I think that's quite exceptional for the area, and that's why I think it's so striking, and it's so easy to romanticize the whole of the story on that basis. I think there are many true instances of encounter in that sense, and this genuine link between these communities who were trying to survive in the middle of the steppe, in a sense, and struggling with the Argentine state. I mean, things could have been quite different, you know, if we compare to what they are now. I think that the traditional approach has been that. So the settlers managed to do this. Maybe people were focusing on how peaceful that the Welsh were by nature, and how religious the Welsh were, and that was seen as the basis of this peaceful coexistence. An Argentine researcher called Marcelo Gavirati has done extensive research on the commercial exchange between those two peoples, and he's proved that there's more than just good intentions. There was a very concrete basis for that peaceful coexistence, but that is disrupted by the arrival of the conquest of the desert. And I think my focus on the implications of the Welsh settlement as a settler colonial venture are more to do with what we do with that now. Because for some time, I can see that the Welsh community and the province of Chubut, and in a sense Argentina, is taking pride on that link in order to look away from other pressing issues. And so I think that's what is important about considering the Welsh settlement a settler colonial venture, that the Welsh never gave permission for us to settle their lands. And so however peaceful that coexistence was, you know, however friendly the links were, there is something there that hasn't been resolved, even in the case of the Welsh settlement. And I agree that it's not the responsibility of the Welsh community or of Wales in general to resolve that. I think it's in a sense the responsibility of Argentina as a state, and all of us Argentinians, and I include myself, of course, to recognize what's happened there and to do something about it. At the same time, I can understand how difficult it is for Welsh people who have been so attached to that lovely romantic image of the Welsh settlers over there being friendly and empathizing with indigenous inhabitants, to all of a sudden be faced with this. And I do feel sorry for that, but I think it doesn't help to just look away and congratulate ourselves for the things we've done well, when there are such urgent issues to resolve.
Yeah, and do you think that it is, you know, it's quite easy for Welsh people living in Wales to adopt the narrative, well, do you know what, all that romantic picture of Patagonia was incorrect. We were, you know, settler colonialists, just like everybody else across the world or from Europe who had this kind of relationship. We were just the same as everybody else. And if we're here living in Wales, we can just accept that narrative without really, we can change our narrative, and it doesn't really make much difference to our everyday lives, if you like. Whereas the Welsh descendants in Patagonia, they are the people who have to live with the change of narrative on a daily basis. So I think that it's quite, you know, who takes that responsibility and who has to deal with that responsibility as well. I think there's an interesting parallel there too. It's very comfortable to do it from here, I think.
But it's, if I may say something, I was surprised by the resistance that has provoked in some circles. So sometimes if you say something negative about the Welsh settlement in Patagonia, people take it very personally as an attack on Welsh nationalism. And it's like, oh, you're trying to attack Michael D. Jones, and it's like this sacred cow, you can't touch that. So it doesn't seem that easy, to be honest, but I agree that it's a lot more difficult when you're living there and something as fundamental as your right to the land is at stake.
Na, diolch fawr iawn. Rhys Cymysgu Jones.
Diolch yn fawr iawn for that paper. Thanks very much. It was really useful. My question is slightly based on the fact that I've been working on 18th century Welsh people's relations with sort of the idea of indigenous North America. And one of the things that seems striking to me in terms of a narrative of Welsh exceptionalism is that Welsh people have planned to do this and done this before in North America. And in much the same way, when it's been done before, what's happened to the Welsh colony is that it's ended up more closely aligned to the colonizing state power in the colony than it has been with the indigenous people in North America. That's just the standard narrative every time it's been tried before. And I wonder to what extent, I know less about the Patagonian guadla, to what extent are previous attempts at sort of Welsh defensive colonization in North America discussed in the guadla? And to what extent is a kind of deliberate forgetting of the fact that it's all gone wrong before, sort of part of that narrative of sort of forgetting and indigenization and exceptionalism in the Patagonian guadla?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So when are you asking about the Argentinian Patagonian context now? So to what extent that is discussed in that context?
Yeah, to what extent is does the sort of Patagonian guadla compare itself and think about previous attempts in North America?
Yeah, it doesn't, because it's this exceptional narrative, because it's unthinkable that because the Welsh were escaping oppression, that seems to be the grounds for their inability to colonize. They can't be colonizers because they were escaping colonization in their own land. And so there is reference to Welsh colonies in the US, or Welsh settlements in the US, because that's where this idea, Michael D. Jones, this idea of looking for somewhere remote without any sort of contact with the English language came up. But it's only discussed in that context. And then because it is so exceptional, it's not compared with anything. And at the same time, it has the same problem, I think, although that started to change recently. It's the same problem within Argentina as a settlement, let's say. So it's not compared to other immigrant settlements because it's so exceptional, because it created its own rules, because it was so early, because it had such different features in a sense. And I think that's a problem.
Okay, thanks very much.
You're welcome.
Diolch yn fawr iawn. Diolch. Oes na ddwylo eraill i fyny? I need to change my view, I think, in order to see the gallery, to see if there are any other people opening their mics or hands going up. Jane Aron.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, Geraldine. Many thanks. Very interesting. Is it still true? Is it still the case that when they went originally to Patagonia, they believed it was, when the Welsh went originally, they believed it was uninhabited territory? Or when they went originally, did they know that the indigenous people were there? certainly what we are taught is that they believed it was uninhabited territory. I mean, they may have been fooled, but is that the case, or do you think they did actually know that it was inhabited?
Well, I can't be 100% sure, but that my quotes today were from the handbook of the Welsh colony, published in 1862. And you would have thought that anyone interested in emigrating would have read the handbook. If I think about my students, they don't always read the handbook, so it depends on how good they were as students. But you would have thought that someone planning to go to the other side of the world on this venture would at least have read the handbook where the basic facts were explained.
What about the very early ones? When they first went, when Michael D. Jones arranged it, did he genuinely think it was uninhabited territory?
I think the first, when they go on this early exploration trip, it is 1862. So if they didn't know at the time, they would have known about it coming back, because that's when the handbook was published.
Thank you.
You know, in terms of the sort of indigenization of the settler community then, and you showed us a number of visualizations of that then, just thinking about, you know, the traditions of the Eisteddfod in Patagonia. I mean, to what extent would you have that visualized? I've never been to Patagonia, I've never experienced the Eisteddfods there or directly or anything, but, you know, to what extent do you have that visualization of indigenization in those key sort of Welsh cultural events beyond the guila glenyard?
It is very striking, and to be honest, when I was doing my PhD, I hadn't come across settler colonial theory. There wasn't a lot published about that, and I worked with post-colonial concepts, and they seem to capture some of what I saw to a certain extent, but it didn't really work. But I think this double bind that Johnson and Lawson talk about is perfect for the Welsh Patagonian case, because you have that claim to the authenticity of the motherland, so Wales, and yes, we have the chapels and we have an Eisteddfod and so on, but at the same time, the differences with the authentic product from the motherland that allow that claim of authenticity and differentiation as something separate, and you can see that with all of the cultural features of Welsh Patagonia, the Eisteddfod being a very prominent one. So the Eisteddfod now is bilingual, but there are competitions, you know, where people are asked to perform Argentinian folk dances, and so it is, you can see that indigenization straight away. And it's the same with the religious dimension, the chapels, the hymns, which have been translated into Spanish, and they are sung bilingually. Even what people in Argentina, I think, known as Welsh tea and Welsh cake, are not Welsh, they are Welsh Patagonian.
Absolutely. Yeah, and in terms of sort of linguistic aspects of indigenization then and so on, I mean, here we, you know, when we think of Patagonian Welsh, we think of the Spanish language influence on the Welsh language, but are there any examples or any instances of a kind of linguistic indigenization happening as well in the Welsh that is Patagonian Welsh? Is it infused by any, even if it's infused through Spanish, but is it infused in that way that we see that relationship perhaps between present day English use in in New Zealand or so on, where we have Maori infusing English as a kind of perhaps an indigenization process happening there too?
Yes, definitely. And what's interesting is you have that influence of Spanish now, but you also have this differentiation from early on. So from early on, R.J. Berwyn was there organizing the Welsh so that the Welsh spoken in Patagonia would be even better than the one spoken in Wales. And so, you know, there was a Gwersylyfr o Wladfa Gymreig, and the numbers, you couldn't say the numbers in English, the numbers had to be said in Welsh. And I think it was the first textbook where the numbers were written in Welsh, and that was it was first used in Patagonia before it was used in Wales. And the dialectal differences, because there were people, immigrants from North and South Wales, the concoction that produced created a specific Welsh Patagonian dialect that unfortunately is not what you hear these days, because many of the original native speakers are gone. But yes, there was that, regardless of the influence of Spanish, there was that attempt to create something which would be Welsh Patagonian.
And, you know, at the beginning you said that the Welsh said, I can't remember the exact words, I'm like, entendemos el castellano, pero no entendemos el inglés, or something like that, yeah? So, but was there any sort of, is there any evidence of you know, indigenous language infusion into Welsh in any way, or into the Welsh of Patagonia?
This is interesting. I don't think there's anything official, but in some of the chronicles, the Welsh settlers would know some Mapuche or Tehuelche words for the horses, for example, what the horses were called, or things like that. So it was that domain, that linguistic domain, the practical, and you could see what the social role of indigenous peoples was, because that was those were the words which were taught. But I don't think they became integrated into the Welsh language.
No, diolch yn fawr iawn. Iwan Wyn Rhys, oedd Iwan Wyn Rhys ar y radio yr wythnos yma, doedd on Day Thomas Radio Cymru, talking about the Welsh language of Patagonia. Very interesting. I wrando eto, os gollwch chi hwnna. Any other comments or any other questions before we draw this evening to a close? Ifor ap Dafydd.
Diolch yn fawr iawn am bapur diddorol dros ben. Towards the beginning, I think you mentioned the evils of the English education system, as it were, my words, not yours, but how they were misrepresenting what was thought about the community there. There's been a lot of talk recently about reappraising historical figures, and in terms of Welsh Government thinking about how we teach Welsh history to children in the curriculum and so forth. Would you have any comments, or have you looked at how a number of books recently have been representing the history of the Wladfa? For example, I'm just looking at this one here, for example, which talks about Michael D. Jones, and there's no mention of the Tehuelche, the indigenous people. So I don't know if you had a chance to see any of these recent books, especially for children, and what they say about the history of Welsh in the Wladfa. Diolch yn fawr.
Diddorol iawn. I haven't done that officially. I have kept an eye on some of the materials, but I feel, for the reasons that I've explained before, I do feel a bit guilty about challenging some of because I feel that people take it very personally, and it's a bit difficult for me to do that. So in a sense, I'd rather leave that to a Welsh person to do that. And I think Greg Muse has done some really interesting work with some travel writing in the Welsh language. But I do feel I wouldn't like to be the person who does that study, in a sense.
Diolch.
Croeso.
Diolch i fawr, diolch. Unrhyw cwestiynau neu sylwadau pellach, any further comments or questions? I'm just looking quickly to see if there's anybody opening up a mic or putting a hand up. If not, na, dwi ddim yn gweld neb arall. Diolch yn fawr iawn, Geraldine. Mae wedi bod yn bapur bendigedig. Dwi'n meddwl bod ni gyd wedi cael cyfle i feddwl am bob mas o besa. I think that we've really enjoyed your presentation this evening. We look forward as well to any sort of article or book that you may be working on as well too. I don't know what you have planned for this particular aspect too. I know that your book is quite recent as well, isn't it? It's only just 2017. But wir, diolch yn fawr iawn. I think we've had a very wonderful seminar. A diolch o galon I ti. Muchísimas gracias. Diolch yn fawr iawn I ti.
Elin, diolch yn fawr I ti am y gwahoddiad a diolch yn fawr bawb am wrando.
Yeah, dyn ni cael cynulleidfa wych. We've had really excellent attendance this evening. Next week, we won't have a seminar. Mark Williams, due to family reasons, won't be able to present, but in 2 weeks' time, it'll be back to us here at y ganolfan Eirig Salisbury, Prifysgol Aberystwyth, yn cyflwyno seminar Cawn Gynnar, Howddgar Ha, Carolau Haf, Hugh Morris, 1622-1719, a'i gyfoeswyr a'r athro Ann Parry Owen yn cadeirio yr noson honno. Ond tan hynny, diolch yn fawr iawn gyfeillion a diolch yn arbennig i'n siaradwr ni, Dr Geraldine Lublin. Diolch yn fawr iawn. Good evening. Noswaith dda.
Nos da.
Nos da fawr.